Power can change hands in an instant. One moment, you're the most influential law enforcement official in America, and the next, you're in handcuffs, being paraded through a busy airport like a common criminal. But what happens when the man with the handcuffs doesn't realize who he's just arrested? What happens when prejudice blinds an officer so completely that he can't see the federal credentials right in front of him? This is the story of how FBI Director Jim Calloway's routine return from an international conference turned into a national scandal that would end careers, launch congressional hearings, and reshape airport security across America. It's about what happens when a man with a badge meets a man with real power and makes the worst mistake of his life. As Jim Calloway stepped up to that customs counter at Westfield International Airport, Officer Raymond Wells saw only what his prejudices allowed him to see. He couldn't have known that the handcuffs he was about to apply would become the catalyst for his own destruction. He couldn't have imagined that the phone call his detainee would make would send shockwaves through the Pentagon, the White House, and eventually his own life. And he certainly never expected that 15 years of unchecked bias would collapse around him in a single night, all because he chose the wrong traveler to harass. Jim Calloway massaged his temples as he stood in the customs line at Westfield International Airport. 54 years old with salt and pepper hair, the FBI director had just spent a grueling week in Geneva coordinating an international counterterrorism initiative with agencies from 12 countries. The conference had been a success, but the 18-hour flight home left him exhausted. All he wanted now was to clear customs and catch his ride to his Georgetown brownstone, where a hot shower and his own bed awaited. The line shuffled forward. Jim checked his watch, 10:34 p.m. The terminal was quieter than usual, most of the day's traffic having already cleared through. Around him stood a handful of weary travelers, a young couple with matching backpacks, an elderly gentleman in a business suit, and a mother trying to soothe a fussy toddler. As he approached the front of the line, Jim noticed a TSA agent eyeing him with unusual scrutiny. Officer Raymond Wells, according to his badge, was a stocky 42-year-old with close-cropped hair and hard eyes that seemed to be permanently narrowed in suspicion. Wells had been with airport security for 15 years, and what had started as a respectable career had soured over time as personal biases began influencing his work. Jim stepped up to the counter when called, producing his diplomatic passport and credentials. Purpose of travel? Wells asked without looking up. Government business. Returning from Geneva, Jim replied, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came naturally after 3 decades in law enforcement. Wells flipped through the passport with deliberate slowness. And what kind of government business would that be? Jim raised an eyebrow. This level of questioning was unusual for someone with diplomatic clearance, especially at this hour. International Security Conference. I have my credentials right here. He slid his FBI identification across the counter. Wells barely glanced at the ID. Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening. Is there a problem? Jim asked, fatigue making his words sharper than intended. Just standard procedure, Wells replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. Follow me, please. Jim's jaw tightened. This was far from standard procedure, but creating a scene would only exacerbate matters. 28 years with the Bureau had taught him when to pick his battles. He followed Wells to a small windowless room off the main concourse. Empty your pockets and place your bags on the table, Wells ordered. Jim complied, setting his government-issued secure phone, wallet, keys, and diplomatic passport on a metal table. His carry-on contained only clothes, toiletries, and a secured laptop. You'll need to unlock this, Wells said, picking up the laptop. That contains classified information. I cannot unlock it without proper authorization, Jim explained calmly. Wells' face hardened. Sir, failure to comply with security procedures is grounds for detention. Officer Wells, Jim said, maintaining his composure. I understand you're doing your job, but that laptop contains sensitive national security information. Contact your supervisor, and we can handle this appropriately. Something shifted in Wells' expression, a flickering of recognition, perhaps, or simply annoyance at being challenged. Are you refusing to comply with security directives? I'm following federal protocol for handling classified materials, Jim clarified. I'm happy to verify my identity and authorize a security check through proper channels. Wells stepped back, hand moving to his radio. I need backup in screening room 3. Within minutes, 2 additional officers arrived. Jim recognized the dangerous escalation occurring but remained outwardly calm. This individual is being uncooperative and has refused to allow inspection of his belongings, Wells told his colleagues. He claims to be some kind of government official. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Jim stated firmly, reaching slowly for his credentials again. Contact the Bureau's Washington field office to confirm my identity. Yeah, and I'm the president, Wells scoffed. We get people claiming all sorts of things. Hands where I can see them. One of the other officers, a younger man named Trent Patterson, frowned. Sir, can I see your ID again? Jim nodded, but before Patterson could examine the credentials, Wells stepped between them. He could be using forged documents. We need to detain him until we can verify his identity, Wells insisted. This is unnecessary, Jim said, his patience wearing thin. A simple phone call. Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back, Wells interrupted, unclipping the handcuffs from his belt. Jim stared at him in disbelief. You're making a serious mistake. Last warning, Wells threatened. Realizing the situation had spiraled beyond reason, Jim slowly turned and placed his hands behind his back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists as Wells secured them with unnecessary tightness. You're detaining the director of the FBI without cause, Jim stated for the record, his voice low but clear. I want your badge number and your supervisor's name. Wells just smirked as he led Jim through the terminal. Travelers stopped to stare as the distinguished-looking man in handcuffs was paraded through the airport like a common criminal. Jim kept his head high, though inwardly he seethed at the humiliation and clear abuse of power. Patterson, trailing behind, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Wells, maybe we should verify his. Do your job, Patterson, Wells snapped. We've got protocol to follow. They reached the airport detention center, a stark area with holding cells for travelers suspected of crimes or immigration violations. Wells roughly guided Jim into an empty cell. You'll remain here until we confirm your identity, Wells said, the smug satisfaction in his voice unmistakable. Shouldn't take more than a few hours, or days. As the cell door closed, Jim took a deep breath to center himself. In 28 years with the FBI, he'd faced down terrorists, crime syndicates, and corrupt officials, but never had he experienced such blatant profiling and abuse of authority firsthand. I want my phone call, Jim stated firmly. Wells laughed. This isn't a TV show. You'll get communications privileges when I say so. Actually, Patterson interjected, airport detainees are entitled to notify someone of their situation. It's in the manual. Wells shot Patterson a venomous look but couldn't dispute the policy in front of the other officer. Fine. One call. Make it quick. Jim was escorted to a phone under Wells' watchful eye. He dialed a number from memory, one few people outside the highest levels of government knew existed. After 2 rings, a curt voice answered. Secure line. This is Director Calloway, authorization code Echo November 735 Whiskey, Jim said clearly. I'm being illegally detained at Westfield International Airport by TSA Officer Raymond Wells. I need immediate assistance. There was a brief pause before the voice responded. Identity confirmed. Stand by, Director. Wells' face transformed as he realized Jim's authorization code had been accepted without question. The smug confidence drained away, replaced by uncertainty. Who exactly did you call? Wells demanded as Jim hung up. The Pentagon, Jim replied simply. I suggest you contact your supervisor immediately. Wells' radio crackled to life before he could respond. Officer Wells, report to the security office immediately. Repeat, report immediately. In the distance, alarms began to sound, not the blaring emergency alerts, but the discreet tones that signaled a security protocol activation. Airport staff began moving with purpose, and through the glass walls of the detention center, Jim could see uniformed officers converging on their location. Patterson re-entered the room, his face pale. Sir, there's a Colonel Bryant from the Pentagon on line 1. And Airport Director Hoffman is on his way down with internal affairs. Wells stood frozen, the full magnitude of his error finally dawning on him. I believe you have the keys to these handcuffs, Officer Wells, Jim said quietly. Wells moved forward mechanically, fumbling with the keys as realization set in. He had just arrested, humiliated, and detained the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. As the handcuffs fell away, Jim rubbed his wrists and straightened his jacket. He fixed Wells with a level gaze that had made hardened criminals confess and corrupt officials resign on the spot. You know, Officer Wells, Jim said in a voice only Wells could hear. In my experience, there are 2 kinds of officers who abuse their authority. those who do it out of fear and ignorance, and those who do it because they enjoy the power. I wonder which one you are. Before Wells could respond, the door burst open. Airport Director Leonard Hoffman, a tall man in his 60s with distinguished white hair, entered with two internal affairs officers flanking him. Director Calloway, Hoffman said, his face ashen. I cannot begin to express. Jim raised a hand. We'll discuss this in your office, Mr. Hoffman. He turned to the internal affairs officers. I want Officer Wells' badge and service weapon secured, and I want access to all body camera footage and security recordings from the last 2 hours. As Wells was escorted away, the reality of what he had done and who he had done it to seemed to finally sink in. His career, built over 15 years, was crumbling before his eyes, all because he couldn't see past his own prejudices when confronted with authority that didn't match his expectations. Jim watched him go, already considering the phone call he would make next, not out of vengeance, but because the system that allowed Wells to operate unchecked for so long needed to change. This incident would have repercussions far beyond one officer's career. But that would come later. For now, he had statements to make and reports to file. His peaceful evening at home would have to wait. Airport Director Leonard Hoffman's office was a stark contrast to the sterile detention center. Warm wood paneling and soft lighting created an atmosphere of calm authority, though nothing could ease the tension crackling through the room at this moment. Jim Calloway sat across from Hoffman, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp as steel. Between them, a phone on speaker rested on the polished desk. General Blackwood, thank you for joining us, Hoffman said, his voice tight with barely contained stress. I wouldn't miss it, came the gravelly response from the speaker. General Thomas Blackwood, at 56, was the Pentagon's Deputy Director of Joint Operations and a longtime ally of Jim's. Their relationship went back 2 decades to a classified operation in Bogota that neither man discussed, but which had cemented an unshakable trust between them. I've been briefed on the situation, Blackwood continued. Director Calloway, are you all right? I'm fine, Thomas, Jim replied, his calm demeanor masking the anger still simmering beneath the surface. A bit of wounded pride, nothing more. Wounded pride? Blackwood's voice rose. You were illegally detained by a rogue TSA agent after identifying yourself as the FBI director. This is unprecedented. Hoffman winced visibly. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. General, I assure you, this incident does not reflect our airport's policies or training. Officer Wells acted completely outside protocol. Did he? Jim leaned forward slightly. Because my understanding is that Officer Wells has a history of random security checks that seem to follow a very specific pattern. The door opened, and Richard Harding, the head of airport security, entered. At 45, Harding had the build of a former athlete now settling into middle age, his brown hair showing the first streaks of gray. His eyes were bloodshot from being called in from home at this hour. Director Calloway, Harding said with a respectful nod. I've pulled Wells' record and the security footage is requested. Jim gestured to an empty chair. Show me. Harding placed a tablet on the desk and pulled up a personnel file. Raymond Wells, 42 years old, 15 years of service. Started with excellent performance reviews, but there's been a pattern of concerning incidents over the last 5 years. Concerning how? Jim asked, though he already knew the answer. Harding scrolled through the file. Multiple passenger complaints about aggressive questioning and discriminatory treatment. 3 formal investigations, all closed without action due to insufficient evidence. And who closed those investigations? Jim asked pointedly. Harding's discomfort was palpable. I signed off on them. I see. Jim's voice remained even, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. And the footage? Harding switched to the security video, which showed Jim's arrival at customs from multiple angles. The footage was crystal clear, capturing every moment of Wells' interaction with Jim. The dismissive glance at his credentials, the aggressive posture, the unnecessary escalation. Continue, Jim said after they watched the initial confrontation. I want to see what happened after I was taken to detention. Harding hesitated. Sir, perhaps we should discuss this privately. Play the footage, Mr. Harding. The video continued, showing a new scene, the security break room. Wells had entered, laughing as he spoke to 2 other officers. You should have seen this guy. Wells' voice came through clearly. Claimed he was the FBI director. Like we haven't heard that before. He mimicked Jim's authoritative tone with mocking exaggeration. The Bureau's Washington field office will confirm my identity, he said in a falsetto that bore no resemblance to Jim's deep voice. One of the officers laughed uncomfortably. You sure about this, Ray? If he's legit. Please, Wells interrupted. Just another entitled suit who thinks rules don't apply to him. These guys all think they're untouchable. Well, not in my airport. Hoffman reached over and paused the video, his face ashen. Director Calloway, I cannot begin to express how deeply. Continue the video, please, Jim said quietly. The footage resumed. Wells was now checking his phone, his expression shifting from smug satisfaction to confusion, then alarm. What is it? One of the other officers asked. Wells didn't answer, frantically typing on his phone. Then the break room door burst open, and Officer Patterson appeared, panic written across his face. Wells, what the hell did you do? Patterson demanded. There are Pentagon officials in the terminal. The airport director is on his way down with IA. Wells' face drained of color. What are you talking about? The guy you arrested? He really asked the FBI director. His authorization code checked out immediately. They're saying the Pentagon Joint Command was activated. The footage showed Wells' expression collapse as realization dawned. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. That's impossible. I checked his ID. It looked legitimate because it is legitimate. Patterson shouted. Do you have any idea what you've done? This is your third strike, Wells. You're finished. At that moment, alarms began to sound in the break room. Wells jumped to his feet, knocking over his chair. Director, I've seen enough. General Blackwood's voice cut through the room as Hoffman paused the video again. This is beyond a simple mistake. This was a deliberate abuse of power. I agree, Jim said, his voice level. Mr. Hoffman, I want Officer Wells' complete employment record, all complaint files, and the names of every supervisor who buried previous incidents. Hoffman nodded rapidly. Of course, Director. Anything you need. And I want to speak with Wells. A silence fell over the room. Harding cleared his throat. He's in interview room 3. Internal Affairs has already begun questioning him. Interrupt them, Jim said, standing. Tell them the FBI director wishes to speak with Officer Wells personally. As they left the office, Jim's secure phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen to see a text from FBI Deputy Director Alan Foster. Situation aware. Team deployed. ETA 10 minutes. The walk to interview room 3 was tense and silent. Airport staff who had been called in for the emergency stood at attention as Jim passed, their expressions a mixture of awe and apprehension. The story was already spreading through the facility like wildfire. Outside the interview room, 2 internal affairs officers stood guard. They straightened immediately upon seeing the approaching group. Director Calloway. One began, We're in the middle of. I'll be speaking with Officer Wells now. Jim interrupted politely but firmly. You can observe if you wish. The officers exchanged glances before stepping aside. Jim entered alone, closing the door behind him. Raymond Wells sat at a metal table, his face haggard and his uniform rumpled. The swagger he displayed earlier had evaporated completely, replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of a man watching his life unravel. He looked up as Jim entered, recognition and fear flashing across his face. Officer Wells, Jim said calmly, taking the seat opposite. I believe we have unfinished business. Wells swallowed hard. Sir, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Jim repeated the word carefully, as if examining an unfamiliar concept. Is that what you call racial profiling and abuse of power these days? A misunderstanding. I wasn't profiling. Wells began defensively. Save it, Jim cut him off. I've seen the footage. I've reviewed your record. This isn't your first misunderstanding, is it? Wells fell silent, his eyes dropping to the table. 15 years of service, Jim continued. Started strong, by all accounts. What happened, Wells? When did you start believing the badge gave you the right to harass people who look like me? It wasn't like that, Wells muttered, but his protest lacked conviction. Then explain it to me, Jim said, leaning back in his chair. Help me understand why an experienced officer would ignore legitimate federal credentials and detain a government official without cause. Wells' jaw worked silently for a moment. You don't understand what it's like. Every day, we're told to watch for threats, to trust our instincts. I was just doing my job. Your job, Jim repeated slowly. Your job is to ensure airport security, not to indulge your personal biases. Your job is to protect travelers, not to humiliate them based on your prejudices. Through the window, Jim could see a commotion in the hallway. A team of FBI agents in tactical gear had arrived, led by Deputy Director Foster himself. Hoffman was gesturing frantically, trying to explain the situation. Wells followed Jim's gaze, his face paling further at the sight of the federal agents. Are they here to arrest me? That depends, Jim said, turning his attention back to Wells. On whether this was a single terrible lapse in judgment or part of a pattern of behavior that you and this airport have been covering up. Wells' shoulders slumped. The bravado that had carried him through 15 years of increasing misconduct had finally failed him. What happens now? Jim studied him for a long moment. Now, Officer Wells, you face the consequences of your actions. Your career in law enforcement is over. That much is certain. The rest depends on how cooperative you choose to be. Cooperative. Wells looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Internal Affairs will want to know about every incident you've been involved in. Every case where you targeted someone based on race or appearance. Every time you escalated unnecessarily. And they'll want to know who helped you bury those incidents. Wells' expression hardened. You're asking me to rat out my colleagues. I'm giving you the opportunity to do one honest thing before you leave this profession, Jim corrected him. Consider it carefully. A knock at the door interrupted them. Deputy Director Foster entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. Director Calloway, Foster said with a nod. At 49, Foster was Jim's most trusted colleague at the Bureau, a brilliant investigator with an uncompromising sense of justice. Are you all right? I'm fine, Alan, Jim assured him. Officer Wells and I were just discussing accountability. Foster's gaze shifted to Wells, his expression cold. We've got a team securing all records and footage. Homeland Security has been notified, as has the Attorney General's office. This incident has their full attention. Wells seemed to shrink in his chair as the full weight of the federal response became clear. What had started as a power trip targeting a traveler had exploded into a multi-agency investigation that would end careers and possibly lead to criminal charges. The Pentagon is requesting an update, sir, Foster continued. General Blackwood has authorized a secure line in the airport director's office. Jim nodded and stood. Officer Wells and I are finished here. He paused at the door, looking back at the dejected figure slumped at the table. Remember what I said. Your cooperation now will be noted in whatever comes next. As Jim left the interview room, Foster fell into step beside him. The media's already got wind of this. We're containing it for now, but by morning, this will be national news. Good, Jim said simply. Foster raised an eyebrow. Sir, this isn't about one officer, Alan. This is about a system that allowed him to operate unchecked for years. Sometimes it takes a spotlight to disinfect a wound. They walked through the terminal, now filled with federal agents collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses. Airport staff watched in stunned silence as the FBI director moved through their midst, a living reminder that no abuse of power, however small it might seem, was truly without consequence. In the distance, through the large terminal windows, the first news vans were arriving, their satellite dishes extending skyward. The story was breaking, and Raymond Wells' name would soon be synonymous with the consequences of unchecked authority. Jim's phone buzzed with an incoming call from the White House. The president would be waiting for a briefing, and the conversation would not be a pleasant one. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Jim felt a sense of purpose rising above his anger. What had happened to him today happened to countless travelers every day, most without the power or platform to fight back. Perhaps it was time for that to change. The morning sun filtered through the blinds in Jim Calloway's Georgetown office. 2 weeks had passed since the airport incident, but its ripple effects continued to spread across the nation. Jim scrolled through the morning news briefing on his tablet, noting that the story still dominated headlines. Airport profiling scandal expands, 12 officers suspended, read one headline. Another proclaimed, congressional hearing set AS Westfield Airport investigation widens. A knock at the door interrupted his reading. Deputy Director Foster entered, carrying a thick folder. The full report, sir, Foster said, placing the folder on Jim's desk. Internal Affairs at Westfield Airport has completed their investigation. Jim opened the folder, scanning the first page. And it's worse than we thought. Wells wasn't an isolated case. There was a systemic problem reaching all the way to Harding. They've documented at least 67 cases of discriminatory treatment over the past 3 years. Jim nodded grimly. And Wells, terminated effective immediately. No benefit, no pension. He's facing federal civil rights violation charges. Airport Director Hoffman has also resigned. Jim leaned back in his chair, contemplating the swift fall of a man who, just weeks ago, had wielded his authority with such casual cruelty. Any statement from Wells? Nothing public. His lawyer advised against it. Foster hesitated. There is one thing, though. He's applied for a security position at North Star Industries. Jim raised an eyebrow. Bold move. He probably figures his airport security experience will outweigh the scandal. What he doesn't know is who's handling the hiring. Ooh. Foster allowed himself a small smile. Daniel Calloway, your son. Jim's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sparked with surprise. Daniel, at 31, had left government service 2 years ago to head security operations at North Star, a major defense contractor. The coincidence was almost poetic. Has Daniel seen the application? This morning. He called me directly. Foster handed Jim a note. He wants to know how you'd like him to handle it. Jim studied the note, then placed it aside without comment. What about the broader investigation? Moving forward on all fronts. The Justice Department is reviewing airport security procedures nationwide. The president is considering an executive order on accountability measures. Jim nodded, satisfaction evident in his measured smile. Progress. The intercom buzzed. Director, your 10 o'clock is here. Mr. Wells. Jim and Foster exchanged glances. Send him in, Jim said. Raymond Wells entered the office, a shadow of the arrogant officer who had arrested Jim 2 weeks earlier. His shoulders were hunched, his expression haunted. Without his uniform, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, he seemed smaller somehow. Director Calloway, Wells said, his voice hoarse. Thank you for seeing me. Jim gestured to a chair. Have a seat, Mr. Wells. Foster excused himself, closing the door behind him. I'm surprised you wanted to meet, Wells began, fidgeting with his hands. After everything. I'm a believer in closure, Jim replied simply. And in understanding motives. Wells nodded, swallowing hard. I've lost everything. My job, my pension, my reputation. My wife's left me. I can't even get hired as a mall security guard. Actions have consequences, Mr. Wells. I know that now. Wells looked up, meeting Jim's gaze directly for the first time. I'm not asking for sympathy. He paused. I need to understand why this happened to me. Jim's expression hardened slightly. Happened to you? An interesting perspective. I would have thought the question was why you made it happen. Wells flinched. That's not what I meant, isn't it? 15 years of targeting travelers based on your biases. Dozens of documented incidents. And you're wondering why consequences finally caught up with you. I was doing my job, Wells insisted, though with less conviction than before. No, Jim said firmly. You were abusing your job. There's a difference. Wells fell silent, the truth of Jim's words hanging in the air between them. You've applied at North Star Industries, Jim said after a moment. Wells looked up in surprise. How did you? Did you think that would work out for you? That your record wouldn't follow you? I have experience, Wells said defensively. I thought maybe. The security director at North Star is my son. The color drained from Wells' face as comprehension dawned. Your son? I didn't. I had no idea. Of course you didn't, Jim said evenly. Just as you had no idea who I was at the airport. That's the problem with prejudice, Mr. Wells. It blinds you to the reality of who people actually are. Wells seemed to collapse in on himself, the last vestiges of hope vanishing. I came here today, hoping for, I don't know, forgiveness maybe. Wells shook his head. But you're right. Why should you forgive me when I can't even admit what I did? Jim studied him thoughtfully. That's the first honest thing you've said. The phone on Jim's desk rang. He checked the caller ID, then answered on speaker. Daniel. I was just thinking about you. Dad, Daniel's voice filled the room. I have Raymond Wells' application here. Given the circumstances, I wanted to check with you before proceeding. Wells froze, his eyes widening as he realized whose voice he was hearing. Mr. Wells is actually sitting in my office right now, Jim said, watching Wells' reaction carefully. Is he? Daniel sounded surprised. Well, that's unexpected. Jim considered his next words carefully. The easy path would be vindictive satisfaction, ensuring Wells never worked in security again. But 28 years in law enforcement had taught Jim that justice and vengeance were different paths. Daniel, I think Mr. Wells has learned some difficult lessons recently, Jim said finally. Lessons about accountability, about the consequences of bias and abuse of power. Wells looked up, confusion replacing dejection on his face. What are you suggesting, Dad? Daniel asked, his voice cautious. I'm suggesting that people can change when properly motivated. And that second chances, while not deserved, can sometimes be necessary. Jim kept his eyes on Wells as he spoke. Perhaps North Star's new security training program could use someone with first-hand experience of how power can corrupt. There was a long pause before Daniel responded. You're serious. Consider it. Not in a position of authority, but as an example. Sometimes the best teacher is someone who's made the worst mistakes. After the call ended, Wells stared at Jim in disbelief. Why would you do that? After what I did to you? I'm not doing it for you, Jim said, rising from his desk. I'm doing it because meaningful change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from transformation. Jim moved to the window, looking out over the city. What happened at that airport has already changed security protocols nationwide. It's revealed systemic failures and hidden biases. But real, lasting change? That requires more than new policies. What does it require? Wells asked quietly. Jim turned back to face him. It requires people like you to acknowledge your mistakes fully and work to ensure others don't repeat them. As Wells left the office, Jim knew the man's path forward would be difficult. The damage he had caused, both to others and to himself, wouldn't be easily repaired. But in that damage was the possibility of growth, a change that reached beyond a single incident at an airport. The intercom buzzed again. Director, the Attorney General is on line 1 about the new accountability initiative. Jim smiled as he reached for the phone. Sometimes justice came in unexpected ways and from the most unlikely catalysts. What Raymond Wells had intended as an act of discrimination had instead sparked a national conversation about power, prejudice, and the true meaning of security in America. It wasn't the ending Wells had expected when he detained a traveler 2 weeks ago. But perhaps, for everyone involved, it was the ending that was needed.